Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Father-Son Packers podcast, your source for Packers news, notes, and analysis. My name is Tommy. I'm here, one of your hosts, and I'm here, as always, with my dad, Matt. Dad, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. It's a beautiful sunny day out here in the Bay Area, so that's a perk. And we're still waiting.
We are still waiting. We are coming to you here. We are recording Friday afternoon, March 24th. And as of now, still no Rodgers news. We talked about it a lot on the last podcast. You can go give it a listen there. But it sounds like the Packers and the Jets are still at an impasse in terms of compensation talks. There have been a lot of talks about who has the leverage, who doesn't have the leverage. Pretty much, it's been, in my opinion, I don't know about you, Dad, it's been exactly the same conversation rehashed essentially a dozen different ways and a dozen different times. There's not a whole lot of new information around. The only real new bit of information is that Elijah Moore was traded along with a third-round pick for a second-round pick, and that was a player that some people consider to be open to being part of the trade package. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the show, talking about maybe how we think those negotiations are going, just to touch on it, because that is probably the biggest piece of Packers news. But before we get into anything today, we just wanted to pitch a couple of things very quickly. If you like what you hear here, come follow us on Twitter at FatherSonPacker. We would really appreciate it. We tweet out when we have new episodes, articles we find interesting. We tweet out any injury updates, news around the trade market, news around free agency. You can come find us there. We also are doing a Mock Draft Monday series where we're tweeting out a new mock draft every week. If you want to come interact with those, tell us what picks you like, tell us what picks you don't like. We'd love that. And then you can also find us on all podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, etc., etc. Wherever podcasts are found, you can find us. Come give us a follow there. And if you really like us, come subscribe to us on YouTube. We put all our episodes there as well. And if you subscribe there, it would really just give us, it would help our algorithm a lot. You know how these things go. And so we would really appreciate it. But Dad, let's get into talking Packers today, as we often do. And let's start with some pro days and kind of draft day news. I think the biggest bit is that we have some news on official visits with Green Bay. And before we talk about these very quickly, I would just like to plug Packers Wire has a tracker for these that is very good. You can find on their page, packerswire.com. It's an extension of USA Today. And they essentially just have a list of, they're updating essentially when news is published about who is going to visit with the Packers. You get a certain number of
the top 30 list or whatever it is.
These visits, individual visits with the teams. And so far, Dad, it's just been Darnell Washington, the massive tight end out of Georgia, and Will McDonald IV, the lengthy pass rusher out of Iowa State. Any thoughts on these two guys?
Right. So Darnell Washington, we already kind of knew he was a freak athletically, as well as being enormous as a tight end from just his tape at Georgia, though they didn't use him that much as a receiver. But at the combine, he was just crushing it with the much more athletic than people thought. And if you saw his the blocking sled, he's like doing the work that it seems like any two of the other tight ends would have been doing together. So he just seems like by far the most powerful blocker out there, as well as like an amazing one-handed catch. But kind of exciting. The question is still a little up in the air: exactly how high is it going to go? Is he now moving up into mid first round rather than mid second round? It's a little bit kind of nebulous.
It seems to me that, like, from the mock drafts I've been watching, he's going anywhere from middle of the first to like top of the second. It seems like to me. The Packers met with him, so clearly they think he's in play at one of those two picks that they have.
And I think the other thing is the mock drafts are still responding to the testing numbers that have come out, and so I think they have not quite. I think that's why there's a little less consensus. Is players are moving from their pre-combine and workout projections to the newer projections.
And the thing you mentioned about Darnell Washington not getting much like usage at Georgia, part of that is his fellow tight end, who is not in the draft this year, I believe he'll be in the draft next year, won the Mackey Award this past year and was also the freshman of the year in 2021. So he was the second best tight end on his own team, but also this other guy's Brock Bowers, who was a very good tight end prospect. He was taking up a lot of those tight end targets. And so it's not necessarily a knock on Washington as it is just like this other guy on his team was also very, very good and is going to be like a very, very highly touted tight end prospect coming out of college.
Yeah. But if there's anybody in the draft who might be Mercedes Lewis, it's Darnell Washington.
Yeah, and like, I mean, what was it, the second or third best short shuttle of any player at the combine?
Only Jackson Smith and Jigba, a 6 foot, 203 pound? No, not even 6 feet, right?
Maybe like, around 6 foot,
around 6 foot, 203 pound wide receiver beat him at 6'7", 270.
He's like 280, I think.
280, yeah. So yeah, he beat all these other defensive backs. Whoever had the short shuttle, he beat them all except for Smith and Jigba.
Yeah, actually, the combine actually only has him at 265.
265. You slim down a little bit but you never know how accurate those team listings are anyway.
Well, the other thing with him, and we don't want to talk too much about prospects since we've been doing this a lot, and we don't have a whole lot of information, is, I mean, he's so big. A lot of people were talking about before this draft process, and more so in the past college football offseason, like, hey, like, in terms of a pro prospect, does he try and go the Jason Peters route where he just puts some pounds on him and play him a left tackle? See what happens.
He's got some blocking power.
Oh, yeah. He's a big man. And then the other player that they met with that we mentioned was Will McDonald IV out of Iowa State. He is interesting. He's been going anywhere from late first, middle second, sometimes as high as middle of the first. He's a little on the smaller side, only 6'3", 239 pounds, but he has super long arms, like 90th percentile arm length, so he's really lengthy. 9.72 RAS, so he's a very elite athlete as well. He's a little old. He'll be 24 at the start of the season, but we did see with Devontae Wyatt last year that that's not as big of a threshold for them right now. Maybe that has to do with COVID seasons, and we'll see them slide back to going younger. But
that's what I expect. When we get another year or two and we've gotten past the classes that were affected by COVID cancellations and the special exemptions to go back to school, that they may go back to their traditional age limits. The other thing, did you want to say anything more about McDonald?
McDonald, I mean, he's a little small for what they usually look for an edge rusher, so I'm a bit surprised they're deciding to meet with him. But he's a good player. He's a really good athlete.
I would say one thing I'd like kind of pop in here about their visits. I think one thing it tells us, maybe not the exact player they end up drafting.
Position
and round.
Yeah.
I think that means they're looking for a tight end and an edge rusher in the first 2 rounds. That'd be my take on what this means. Yeah. Often they'll also interview people who are like priority UNFAs.
Yep. Although they've done that a little less.
Somebody else that they did right. They did a little less under Gutekunst
than because Ted Thompson, that was like all they used their visits for. Yeah,
they may have talked to people at the I think they also had some meetings with prospects at the combine.
Oh yeah, they met with like every tight end at the combine. They met with
There are a whole.
This is just the top 30 visits.
This is a little different. But in some of those, I think they have also been players you might expect to be UNFAs or later round.
And the thing is, like, yes, they are probably looking tight end and edge rusher early. I'm not surprised by that, and this seems to indicate that. But they also have a lot of visits left to go, so we're probably going to see a lot more positions as well.
I also expect that they will take they're going to take 2 tight ends this year.
I would hope so, because the tight end room is barren, and we're going to talk about this later. The free agency tight end room is not very... The cupboard is not stocked, yeah.
Yes, but edge rusher would... they may end up only drafting 1 edge rusher. We'll see. So the other thing that I should we're into sort of pre-draft process, getting to see more players. Some notable pro days have been going on. Ohio State, Alabama, Gutekunst, and I think some of the scout staff have been there watching the players not only do the drills they didn't participate in the combine, but also some pass catching drills for the receivers and other things, see how they look, as well as the quarterbacks who, the ones that have been getting all the hype are not really relevant for the Packers. Mm-hmm. But and I haven't really compiled all the details from the players who hadn't tested before, but one notable is Jackson Smith and Jigba, who we mentioned already, did his 40.
Yep, and I would say wasn't blazing
fast, but it was fast enough where people aren't going to worry about his speed.
Yeah,
and
it was for reference, I think
Anywhere
it was
from-
a 4.53 to a 4.49 in terms of his first and second. And pro days are always faster, but that means he's probably
though
around
maybe
the
with
4.5s.
that crazy fast track they've had in Indianapolis the last couple of years, maybe they're not faster anymore.
Maybe. And then in terms of pro days, Brian Gutekunst was at Ohio State's pro day, Penn State's pro day, Alabama's pro day. So he seems like he was at,
and maybe somebody from the staff was at the Virginia pro day. I think they went, and there's some other pro days that have happened already that have some notable prospects, receivers, tight ends.
And then apparently the Packers had scouts at Iowa State's pro day.
For Xavier Hutchinson as well as for
Will McDonald, probably.
Oh, right. Will McDonald, of course. Right. And they're probably watching both of them.
The other piece of interesting news I felt like around the pro day circuit, the tackles at Ohio State performed really well. So that's interesting because they're kind of projected to go near around where we're picking. I would be a little surprised if they took a tackle, but I mean, Brian Gutekunst loves his big guys.
Really surprised if they take a first-round tackle this year when their line is back to being healthy and seems pretty deep. And they usually don't. I mean, they've been able to get good starters later in the draft.
Yeah, and then the other interesting piece of pro day news I thought was that Dalton Kincaid, the tight end out of Utah, who a lot of people have as their first tight end, and almost everyone has at least as a top 3 tight end, did not participate in the pro day for them after also not testing at the combine. Seems to have a back injury, and injuries were a big question mark for him coming out of college. So not great for his stock. Definitely something to keep an eye on because I personally was also very high on him. I mean, obviously this is hyperbole, but he gets comp to Travis Kelce a lot. He's very smooth. He's a really good receiver. He had like 16 catches versus USC in one game.
Right. Oh, he's had like a minuscule number of drops as well.
Yeah,
his catch percentage is really high.
He's a really good player. It's just the fact that he hasn't been able to
is a little bit worry. Yeah. Wonder what that'll probably affect his draft position.
Oh yeah, and the fact that he hasn't been able to participate in nearly any of the pre-draft processes is not a good sign.
Yeah. Anyway, we've been speculating about not much information for a little bit here, but there's been actually a little bit of Packers related or Packers news in terms of players being signed and traded and things, and what it might mean, and some of it might also will mean something in terms of the draft as well. Who ends up, and some players have come back to the Packers as well as the players they've lost.
One thing I did want to ask really quick though, if we just
sure
lap back to Daniel Jeremiah released his mock draft 3 days ago on Tuesday. He's one of those guys that's really plugged into the league, works for NFL Network, knows stuff. And did you see who he had picked for the Packers at 15?
I did not see this week's because I was traveling, so I haven't seen his. Yeah, he was probably one who started getting a linebacker early to the Packers last year, and I was like, no way, that's ridiculous. They just signed a linebacker. They haven't valued before. They just re-signed Campbell, but he was right. So who did he pick? Who did he?
And so we were just saying, Brian Gutekunst loves his big guys. Paris Johnson Jr., tackle out of Ohio State, is who Daniel Jeremiah has them picking at 15 in this latest mock draft.
I almost said like this is gonna be like last year. If I say like they're not gonna pick a tackle, they're all set. Last year they're not gonna pick a linebacker, they're all set.
Yep, there's no way they pick a linebacker. I mean, I was one of those people, admittedly, where I was like, there's absolutely no way that they pick a linebacker in the first round, and yet here we are, and they did because they had never done it before. And this year, I mean, obviously, I think this all changes a bit if someone matches and Nyman ends up leaving.
That's what I wonder. If they pick a lineman, a tackle, that might mean something for the rest of the roster.
Yeah, and I think
in terms of who's going and who's staying and for how long.
And if they, so it seems like he's clearly hearing something at least about tackles. And I mean, Brian Gutekunst was just at Ohio State's pro day, so maybe there was some talk there. It's hard to know. The other big fish in the NFL draft landscape who was also plugged in does mock drafts. It's Mel Kiper of ESPN, and he had the Packers taking Lucas Van Ness at 15. So in terms of these are people who do like mock drafts, like I think Trevor Sikkema coined this phrase, but do mock drafts with their ears, quote unquote, which means like this is just what they're hearing around the league, and they might be hearing it from like other outside parties that have connections. But I could see them taking Van Ness. I wouldn't personally love it, but I think I would be less surprised than them picking Paris Johnson.
I've seen Van Ness to the Packers for a while now, and then maybe fading off a little bit. We'll see whether that. I don't know if that's something that's kind of older news, because that was something I was hearing like a month ago. Just meaning I don't have any sources.
You don't?
Seeing other.
Are you sure?
I have one, and it's not something you generally rely on, as in where I pull it out of. But I was, mostly what I see people mocking to or projecting players going to.
Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to add around the pro day circuit, draft stuff, or because I think next we were going to touch on the Rodgers negotiations briefly and then hit free agency quickly?
Yeah. So the Packers Jets, as we mentioned at the beginning, appear to be at an impasse. There's not really been any progress. And the latest news is sort of trade adjacent with the Jets. So, they've been adding players to the roster that Rodgers wanted. Lazard on his not wish list. Lazard got signed, and Lazard said, I'm looking forward to playing with Rodgers.
A lot of smoke around Odell going to the Jets recently in the past week.
Yeah, just the last couple of days, I think that's gotten a little hotter about Odell going to the Jets. And they signed Mecole Hardman as a free agent, and then traded Elijah Moore, plus a third, as you mentioned, to Cleveland for a second. And so now the Jets have the 42nd and 43rd picks, so back-to-back in the second round.
Yeah, and so the interesting thing about that is 42 and 43, according to the Jimmy Johnson trade chart, which is a bit outdated, teams don't really use it as much anymore, but it's still a good benchmark, would be, according to that, about the value of the 16th pick. So I guess let's just talk a little bit about these negotiations. I guess my first question, Dad, is if you had the choice between that 43rd pick or Elijah Moore, which would you have rather had in this trade? Let's say everything else is the same, but you would have the choice of having the 43rd overall pick or Elijah Moore. Which would you have rather had? Because I personally would have rather had Elijah Moore. Let's say they're acquiring this 43rd pick in order to package it in a trade to the Packers. Just completely hypothetical, just pulling this out of where. But if that was the case, I personally would rather have Elijah Moore. And I was someone who was very high on him coming out of the draft. I know he's had some trouble in his second. He had some trouble in his second year with the Jets. I know him and Mike LaFleur did not have.
And part of that trouble was with Matt LaFleur's brother.
Yeah, and so I think that could definitely have something to do with it. Apparently, he told Mike LaFleur to go blank himself. Multiple reports, and he also got benched for like large swaths of the season after having a very promising first year. And just a very talented player. They picked him at the top of the second round. I feel like I would have rather had him than a 43rd overall pick. Obviously, we don't even know if that 43rd overall pick would be included in this kind of trade, but I was really high on Elijah Moore, and I would have been interested in him being included in the trade. What do you think?
He might be a little bit more of a sure thing than, say, a second-round wide receiver this year.
Especially in a poor wide receiver class.
Yeah, though they might be looking to pick somebody more like tight end at that spot, or pass rushing defensive tackle or edge at that point too. That I think there's some defensive tackles and edges that I like around that range. Of course, this is all just guess range. Sometimes you mock draft and you pick players that are usually in that ballpark of the range, and then sometimes they end up going 50 picks earlier or later.
Yeah, I mean,
when the real draft happens.
The real draft is always part of the reason it's so much fun is just that it's so unpredictable. Like the first 10 or so picks are usually pretty chalk, 10, 15. Sometimes the whole first round is chalk, but then you just start seeing picks out of nowhere. And it does seem that
as well.
Exactly. And it does seem that the NFL wasn't as high on Moore. The move from, I think it was the 76th pick to the 43rd pick, with this trade of Moore is about the value of the 66th pick. So about a high third rounder seemed to be his value around the league, or at least that's what he was traded for essentially. So not as valuable as that pick would be. And so I guess my follow-up question is I guess this is a bigger question, is what do you think reasonable compensation looks like? And I kind of want to set the table here. So this is reasonable compensation with the Jets because, this is all the Packers are probably spending like 70% of 60% of their time on, just talking with the Jets about trying to squeeze every drop out of this. And recently, Packers Wire, referencing again, collaborated with Jets Wire, both, I think, extensions of USA Today, if I remember correctly. And they did a mock trade negotiation. So essentially a bunch of Jets writers, a bunch of Packers writers. And what they essentially settled down to, we retweeted this article as well if you want to go find it. Once again, it's at FatherSonPacker. And what they landed on, and so this was before the Elijah Moore trade, was pick 43 this year, Elijah Moore, and a conditional 2024 first if Rodgers plays multiple seasons. And so that was something that I guess both Packers and Jets writers agreed on. Now that Moore is kind of off the table, and with that as a bit of a framework in terms of that's how Jets parties seem to think is a reasonable price. What are your thoughts on that kind of compensation, and what are your thoughts on what the compensation should be overall? Do you agree with a package like this, or obviously it can't be the same package because Moore is now off the table? But I would have been happy with this trade personally.
Yeah, I would have been happy with that trade. I think that's mostly because I think this is sort of where the smoke seems to be blowing in this direction. And so now maybe the Packers said, we don't want more. And awesome. And that's why the Jets made this trade. So maybe now the trade's going to be, the 2 seconds, and maybe the Packers are still holding out for that number 13 overall pick. But maybe it's going to end up being 2 seconds, and maybe a player like Ruckert, somebody who's not as the tight end that was a rookie last year. That would be something I would like, actually, if Ruckert was added. I'd rank him more than, say, Denzel Mims or Corey Davis as a player thrown in. And then a 2024 pick that is a third if it's 1 year Rodgers in the playoffs, and then can scale up to a first rounder if they make the Super Bowl or he plays another year. And so
it seems like both sides kind of agree that a 2024 conditional on him staying, him playing a certain level, them having a certain amount of team success is very reasonable. I think that will end up being part of the deal. The other thing I've seen floated around by people like Mosqueda and stuff like that is just the 2 seconds and a 15-13 swap. I hate
that 15-13 swap. A lot of people put it in there. It's almost nothing.
Yeah, it's really not much.
It's like the big deal is it's not like it's a 30th and 13 swap as the 2 first round swaps. You gain almost nothing, and for most teams, the player I should say most of it, for a lot of the time, the player you want is still going to be there 15 or it's such a small difference. It can't be the main thing. It's got to be an almost nothing throw in.
To me, a trade up like that on draft day is there's a lot more value moving 15-13 than 2 months beforehand.
Right, that's a trade you only make during the draft if the player you want is there.
Yeah,
because and then you say, I want to go get that particular player. You don't do it ahead of time just for draft capital because it adds so little. But if there's let's say Smith and Jigba is still there, or Will Anderson has fallen down to 13.
Yeah, or I don't know. I mean, Jalen Carter, there's problems there, but if he's there, if there's a player that's this blue chip level player that you're very high on, making that move and moving from 15-13 makes sense. Moving 15-13 a month away from the draft just feels like such a minuscule move. It seems so, because you can move up day of draft 15-13 for a third round pick probably, or a late second. It doesn't. It seems like it cannot be. So yeah, they'll be because 2 seconds for Rodgers, I wouldn't think that's reasonable. I would want a 24 conditional pick of some kind, but and then they're oh, we'll sweeten the pot and we'll swap 13 and 15 for you. It's all right, what? That doesn't.
That's something Jets fans are throwing in there. We'll swap first and give you a fourth
Yeah,
for Rodgers and a third.
And the value that people seem to view Rodgers as, especially in the Packers media base, I mean, seems like there's such a range. Like, some people are like, oh, we'll take, like, so I've seen Packers reported be like, we'll take a third and a fourth for Rodgers just to get off the contract. And I'm just like, that's just bad business. Like, maybe that probably helps you, but there's no reason you can't get more than that. Like getting off the contract is good. We're not to the point where you need to, this is not Brock Osweiler. We are not, the sole goal is not just to get off the contract. Like, you can get something out of this.
And I'm just making this up. The Jets lowball like a crazy amount because they go, Packers just wanted the contract. Tell them to get lost, take a hike, and we'll trade him to some scrub team. We'll trade him to Indianapolis for a conditional third.
We'll trade him to the Patriots. Right. You have to play him twice a year.
Right, and trade them for like pennies on the dollar if they're trying to give you pennies on the dollar anyway. So forget it.
Yeah, and it doesn't. A third and a fourth. I feel like the fact that I've heard Packers like reporters and like journalists who like otherwise opinion I really respect say that that's what they would accept for a Rodgers trade. It's like, no, that's not nearly enough.
You could obviously open it up to other teams. It's like, no, Jets are giving us nothing. You want to give us something so you can go beat the Jets?
Yeah, it's like, and the thing is, it's like I'm at the point where it's like I think.
And then you tell Rodgers the Jets didn't even want to give a third for you.
Yeah, go burn them down. Go burn them down.
Go burn them down.
But I think, and we know how much Bill Belichick hates the Jets. He hates the Jets. Fun fact. I don't know if you knew that. He really hates the Jets. But the follow-up there, I think, just to wrap up this Rodgers discussion, then we'll talk about free agency a little bit. A bit of a shorter pod today. Not as much news in the news cycle. I think the least I would take is just pick 13. Or like both seconds in a conditional 2024 that's like a third, a second if he plays the whole year, and a first if he throws for 4,000 yards and they make the playoffs. I think that's kind of something that I would be amenable to.
Yeah, I think even if it's I would say it's the first or the 2 seconds and a conditional pick in 2024.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of where we stand. Some people might say that's too much. I don't know if many people would say it's too little. We're probably on the like higher value side of what we think they can get out of the Jets at this point. But time will tell, and we will be keeping you updated on this entire saga as it continues. I don't know if you saw, by the way, something I meant to tweet out, and I will probably tweet out right after we're done recording this. Is Christian Watson did a interview on Rich Eisen's show
about Trey Lance. Trey Lance is mentioned. At least I saw a tweet about that.
Yeah, he talked about Lance, he talked about Rodgers, he talked about Love, he talked about just draft progress, and I think he was talking about, I don't remember how I got to this point because I was just thinking about Jordan Love, and then I was thinking about what Watson said. But if you haven't gotten a chance to check it out, you should go check it out. He's a really good interview. He's a very good public speaker.
I haven't seen it. I just saw a tweet about it. Well, I think he had like one of the highest, was it the Wonderlic score?
I'm not sure. I don't remember.
Yeah, I think he scored very well on that. Maybe one of the highest. Maybe
did you know he was
in the draft?
He was 5'10", 145 as a junior in high school.
Ooh.
And then he was 6'2", 190 as a senior in high school. Wow. He grew like 4 inches and gained like 50 pounds from junior to senior year, and that's why he had like his only offer was North Dakota State apparently. And then he grew like 2 more inches at North Dakota State and put on like 20 more pounds, 30 more pounds. Crazy. How come that didn't happen to me? That's what I want to know. I was like 5'10", something.
I put on more pounds than that since I started. I haven't gotten any taller.
Maybe just I guess we're not all going to be.
Careful what you wish for.
Yeah, that's true. All right,
I'll give you half your wish. You'll get any taller, but you'll add the weight.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about free agency. We're going to talk a little bit about who's still out there that we think the Packers can get at some of their positions of need, because I think as the roster is currently constructed, we've got some holes. But let's first talk a little bit about who the Packers have added and lost. The Packers recently re-signed Justin Hollins to a 1-year deal. He had 3.5 sacks last year, I thought he was very solid. They added him halfway through the year from the Rams. He
was a
very good athlete,
depth piece that he played a lot of snaps after Gary got injured.
He was their third edge rusher for a good half of the year, and I mean he's not a world beater, but he's a very solid third, fourth guy. He's a good athlete. He can get to the quarterback a little bit. He's not the biggest guy, but he wears a weird number. He wears 47 for some reason. But he's a decent player, and I like the ad for some depth. Good athlete.
I think they had to have the depth. And so now I'm thinking maybe they'll only draft one edge higher towards the top of the draft. For a while I was drafting one really early and one late for extra depth. But now maybe they only need to add one early as a high-end edge rusher to play now, and then maybe eventually take over for Preston when maybe a couple years. But I think they needed to add to that room, so I think that's really good. I wasn't sure if they're going to get him. It took a little while. So these are just free agents that they've signed in the last episode thing. So they also brought back. Speaking of position rooms that need help
depth badly.
They brought in the safety room. They brought Rudy Ford back on a 1-year deal for up to $2.5 million for I think a number of different incentives.
Yeah,
that may suggest how much they expected to play on defense.
And the thing is, it's like he was okay at safety. I mean, he took Darnell Savage's spot for at least 4 or 5 games, and he wasn't great, but he could tackle better than Savage. He got a little lost on coverage quite a few times, actually, more than I think most people realize. I think a lot of people are like, "Oh yeah, Rudy Ford was better than Savage last year." It's like, well, he's a better tackler than him. I mean, he blew a lot of coverages too. I mean, they both blew a lot of coverages, so it is what it is. But at the very floor, he's an elite gunner.
Yes, but they also need people who just play snaps right.
Yeah, they need players to play
because they don't have enough. Of players they can count on that who are actually going to be safeties. They also re-signed. So you might notice the trend here for Packers re-signings.
It's just bringing back special teamers. Just
special teamers
ton of special
and
teamers.
End of the bench emergency depth for defenders. So
what that means to me is I think we're going to see a very young team this year. I would imagine any picks they take
is they don't want. I don't think they're going to sign very many older players, at least not for very long. So they also brought back Corey Ballantyne, another deep depth defensive back.
Yep. More of a special teamer.
And their second outside signing was the long snapper. And
we talked about last time,
and now Tarvarius. Did I get the name right? Tarvarius Moore from San Francisco.
Tarvarius Moore out of San Francisco. Some stuff on him. I mean, he's fast. I was talking to my friend Gavin. Shout out Gavin, who is a Niners fan. Watches the Niners very closely. Apparently his biggest problem is he doesn't take the best angles, which isn't great. But he's really fast, and he's more of a free safety than anything else. So you don't really necessarily want him down in the box. He picked off Patrick Mahomes in the Super Bowl, so that's kind of interesting. But another special teamer most likely probably play some snaps at safety just because they are so desperate for those snaps. But solid player. Do you have any thoughts on him beyond that?
No, I'm hoping that he can, show a little something in this. I'm hoping this defense will be a good fit for him. We'll see. So that he can play a little bit more on as a safety because he needs something at safety. I think he's still going to add one and still maybe two in the draft, depending on how many picks they end up with. In terms of after they moving up and down can change how many total picks they have, especially and how that might affect whether how much they double up at positions. Because I have three or four different positions I have them doubling up on.
Yeah, and the thing with Moore is I guess he had that pick in the Super Bowl, which would have been 2019-2020, right? If I remember, 2019 season, 2020.
The San Francisco.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that was the 2020.
But then he tore his Achilles the following offseason, missed all of 2020, then came back in 2021, and I think he's dealt with some nagging stuff since then as well. So, I think it's such a low-risk signing that doesn't necessarily really matter.
Signed for barely above the minimum. It's the vet contract. So those contracts really don't change the cap at all.
Yeah.
Because the cap calculation is on like this time of year, the top 51 players. And so when you add a player to the cap, it pushes another player off the cap. So if you sign somebody for 1.1 million, it doesn't add 1.1 million to the cap.
Yeah.
It adds like 230. It knocks down to 790, 800,000 players. So it only adds a couple hundred to the cap.
Yeah. Beyond that, though, Packers did lose another guy in free agency. Robert Tonyan did sign with the Bears since last time we had an episode. I am not that concerned. I think he's a fine player, but he doesn't really move the needle for me. I don't think it's going to be enough to do anything with the comp pick formula.
He didn't sign for very much. I haven't seen an update on the comp pick formula, so I didn't have anything more to add to that. I think you have to look at that, see if there's any new calculation, but he didn't. It was a fairly small contract.
Yeah, and then beyond that, anything else for that, or should we talk about briefly touch on some guys that we're interested in, perhaps?
We could, go into, you mean in free agency, what's out there?
Yeah, free agency.
Yeah, and we can maybe not talk about everybody we've got listed here, but just in terms of who is still out there in free agency, particularly positions we think the Packers need the most, in terms of how they can possibly do what they can do in free agency is limited, of course, by how much cap money is. So they're currently at $22 million under the cap right now. That goes down to $13.8 million after the Rodgers trade per over the cap, and then they have some mandatory expenses, essentially the current draft picks and say practice squad and other mandatory costs. That adds up to about $8.6 million. And then if you want to have so that gets it down to $5.2 million. And then if you want to have some money in seasons for any signings, usually they save a few million, 3 or 4 for that. So there's not actually much left to sign, maybe like 1 or 2 other players for smaller contracts, but they could add cap space by extending Gary. That could easily free up like 5 or 6 or 7 million, depending on how they structure it. Or if Rodgers is a post June 1 trade, then instead of being before the draft, that adds a bunch of money to the cap this year. Of course.
Yeah, but they also
left to sign?
Then I was going to say, we've talked about this. It's like yeah, they got money. They don't have anything to spend.
Like the Bears. Bears got lots of money. There's nobody left to sign.
Yeah, it's like, and the thing is, that'd be after the draft. That would have a lot of ramifications on the players they have this year in terms of who they're playing, because I think they are going to have to lean on whatever draft picks they get to play heavy snaps. Beyond that, though, let's talk a little bit about some of these players we're interested in. Let's not talk about all of them. Do you want to start with tight end? Because there's really only one, and I'm not that interested personally.
Yeah, so the tight ends, there were a few of interest out there. The last ones have really just been signed in the less than the last week. Dalton Schultz gone. Hurst signed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and both those guys went for contracts that I thought were fairly reasonable, but I guess just a little bit out of the Packers' ability.
Yeah. So I've looked at some of the lists for available free agents on the PFF tracker, and so the last tight end in the top 150 some players is Irv Smith from Minnesota. So last year he was graded as the 54th best tight end. He missed 2021.
He missed 2021. He missed half of 2022. He hasn't really been able to stay on the field. Is a big reason they signed Hawkinson, or traded for Hawkinson, that is because he couldn't stay on the field. He had a pretty bad injury actually at week 7, I think, and managed to come back for their last week of the year. But I mean, he just hasn't been able to stay healthy. He was a 3rd rounder the same year that they picked Sternberger, so that would have been 4 years ago. Yeah,
I think it was 2019, and his 2020 year was not bad. He was 19th in the league in terms of the rating for tight ends, but and he's projected to make something like $4 million a year. But when you get this late in the free agency period, I think those projected contracts are shrinking.
Yeah, and I'm not super interested, so I'm fine with just moving on to the next position group. I think they'll probably just draft 2 or 3 tight ends, honestly, and maybe see if they can get Ruckert back in the Jets trade. Maybe, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and so then I'd say the position room that's the second most dire right now is probably still safety,
Yeah, I would say most dire.
more than tight end.
More so that its importance is more important than tight end. And the fact that the tight end draft class is actually good, and you're not going to be able to draft any safeties because they're all not good.
So there are a few safeties out there. Some of the big names have gone, but there are a few left with various sort of graded levels and expected salaries.
Yeah. Do you want to just talk about? We'll just each say one we're the most interested in.
Okay.
You want to start us off?
All right. So in terms of possible projected salary, who am I most interested in? And if we're looking for somebody who's more of a stopgap,
while you're thinking about it, I'll just say really quick that another piece of Packers news is that Adrian Amos, while we're talking about safeties, did have visits with the Baltimore Ravens. Hasn't signed with them as of right now, but something to keep an eye on, that he is getting looks from other teams, and he's also from Baltimore, so that would be a good fit for him. Nothing but the best for Amos. He was really good here for a little while, and if they wanted to bring him back, I wouldn't hate it, but it's not looking likely.
So maybe I would say the person who I'm most interested in, maybe it's John Johnson.
I was going to say the same thing.
Because I don't think he's had some good years in the past, though. Yeah, last year wasn't so great. He was 57th in the league.
Yeah,
he's only 28.
Both of his years in Cleveland were pretty disappointing, but his 2020 with the Rams, he was one of the best safeties in the league. Joe Barry was on that staff with the Rams. I think he was the linebackers coach at the time, so he didn't directly coach him, but he is at least familiar with him. That would have been my pick as well. The other one I would have picked, my second pick probably would have been Rapp, because he is the youngest. It's Taylor Rapp, who used to also play for the Rams, so some familiarity there as well. He has visited the Bengals and Patriots, according to Field Yates, so I think that they would probably get priced out of that market if you're the Packers. I don't think they'd be able to afford him. But he would be another one. He's a good tackler, good change of direction, but not very explosive, a little small. He's not a guy that I think you need to get into a bidding war over, especially if other teams are interested. But probably, I think, the second most interesting player on this. But I definitely would have gone Johnson as well for my first pick.
Yeah, and I don't think Johnson. So in other comparisons, Johnson's expected to projected like 1 year, $5.5 million, and Rapp at 3 years, $21 million. So that may what Rapp is 25 and Johnson is 28.
Yeah, but both still young enough.
Oh yeah, young enough.
And then the next position of interest for free agents is D-line. I'm actually pretty interested in a lot of these guys. I think there's definitely some meat on the bone for the D-line position of the players in free agency. I think, I'll just quickly list off the four guys that I had interested in. You can pick the one you're most interested in. I'll pick the one I'm most interested in. But Matt Ioannidis, I think, would be interesting. A'Shawn Robinson would be interesting. Shelby Harris would be interesting, and Poona Ford would be interesting to me. Any of those jump off the page to you?
In terms of who would be the most interesting to me, maybe Ioannidis?
I think as well. He's 29 years old. He was okay last year. I think he's just mostly a solid interior D lineman. His tackling did slip a bit last year, but he would be a good starter. He's had some really good years for Washington. Played 1 year in Carolina last year, and they struggled, but it's not like he's surrounded by a ton of talent there. I mean, Derek Brown's an okay player right next to him, but I don't know. That was just my thought.
Yeah, and Shelby Harris, has he actually been released by the Seahawks yet?
I believe he has been officially released. Yes, I'll double check that while you.
Because that was the story. He was going to get released, and I don't know if he has been yet. He was he rated a little bit higher? He's another one I'd be very interested in if he
he is the oldest of those guys.
He is the oldest.
But I think he is very good. The only thing I'm seeing is still that Garofolo tweet from about 2 weeks ago, where they said they plan to release Shelby Harris. I am not seeing an official release statement.
I'm not seeing him listed as a free agent on either PFF or Spot Track. and see like projected salary range for him yet.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's maybe hasn't quite happened yet.
Yeah, he's a good run defender, solid pass rusher. He was like elite 3 years ago. He's getting a little old now, but he can still play a little bit. Poona Ford wasn't very good last year, but was really good the previous 4 years. I don't know. And then A'Shawn Robinson, if they just want to take a swing at like a good run defender, would probably be pretty cheap. Just a body.
He might be kind of what they're looking for. Second round of free agency, maybe not commanding as much of a salary, trying to reclaim some value by having a good year on a prove it deal, kind of like they did with Campbell.
Yeah, and like it's a fine player. I think it'd just be good to have another player who has played in the NFL along the D line. Would be nice.
Yeah. If I had to guess, if they sign somebody, who's going to be either one of Ford or Robinson.
Yeah. And then let's go down to edge. I think the problem here is either these guys are going to be too expensive, or they're going to be ring chasing and they're not going to want to play for the Packers.
You don't think Packers are going to be a favorite this year?
So the ones I had written down were Clowney, Ngakoue, Leonard Floyd, Melvin Ingram, and Justin Houston. In my opinion, Clowney's probably going to get paid more than he's worth just because of his name. Leonard Floyd probably wants to sign with a contender, I would imagine. Same with Melvin Ingram and Justin Houston. Justin Houston is the most interesting of these to me, personally, just because he was really good for the Ravens, like really good for the Ravens last year. But he is 34 years old, so he's probably going to want to go to a contender. I think the most reasonable of these that they could get is probably maybe Ngakoue if he wants to take like a prove-it-year deal where he's going to get some snaps. But he was bad for Indianapolis last year, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, the one who actually had the best year last year was Houston. Though they also have him projected as having the lowest salary. Well, I guess along with England because they're the two oldest.
And then there's
this is more expensive. This is more expensive position to sign a free agent. As opposed to like safeties, something a little bit easier for the Packers to afford. And you could say they just signed their one edge of free agency.
Yeah, and I think you don't sign like a 1-year edge unless you're a team that thinks you're competing for a Super Bowl. I think just philosophically to me that makes sense just because they are a little more expensive. You're paying like a premium essentially just for pass rush juice. And the difference between having like Houston play however many snaps and playing Hollins however many snaps, like it's not going to take you from like a middle of the pack team, which I think most people would expect them to be next year, to like a contender all of a sudden. I don't know. I don't really want them to add any of these edges. I also don't think they're going to get any of these edges. Yeah,
this is the position I think is they're the least likely to add in free agency now, especially since they brought back Hollins, and so they have,
and it seems like
enough players to play snaps.
And it seems like Gary is progressing well in his healing. So yeah, we haven't heard anything since we heard that he was targeting to be ready by the start of the season, but no news is good news in that case. And Dad, let's wrap it up here and talk a little bit about wide receivers. Shark and Aguilar signed today to where did Shark go again? Well, Aguilar went to the Ravens and Shark went to the Panthers.
Panthers. I was like, it was blue. It's like, that wasn't the Lions.
Yeah, beyond that, Odell, I think there's no chance they get him. The ones I would be most interested in would be Marvin Jones. Fell off last year. He's 33 years old, but he still had 600 yards and 4 touchdowns for the Jaguars. It was just kind of a bit of a crowded receiving room in terms of Christian Kirk getting a lot of work, Zay Jones kind of taking his job a little bit. I think he can still play a little bit, and he can be like a decent vet for cheap. He doesn't have a whole lot of tread left on the tires, but he's a pro's pro, and he's played a lot in the league, and just having a vet in the locker room would be good just for leadership, even if he's not getting a lot of snaps. And then Richie James would be kind of interesting. 27 years old, played for the Giants last year, has had some struggles with health, but he's really explosive. He'd be a gadget return type guy. Had 570 yards and 4 touchdowns for the Giants last year, who didn't even throw the ball much. And Packers don't really have this archetype of player right now on their roster. And he would also be a bit familiar with the scheme because he played in a similar system in San Francisco for his first 3 years in the league. I don't know. I think Richie James is the one I'd be the most interested in.
He might
What do
be
you
the
think?
most excited, the one to be most excited about. I also another player I think that might be signed. Maybe is Jarvis Landry.
Yeah, I would
He
think
might
he would
be
be.
like the younger version of Cobb at this point for them. He didn't do
Yeah,
much last year. His value's got to be really low, after having only 272 yards last year. He'd be more like vet leadership. Um,
yeah. I think he might try and be doing one last rodeo.
he could
Um,
try to go for he might be ring chasing at this point.
yeah, I think Marvin Jones is like past the ring chasing point. I mean, he's only played for like the Lions and the Jaguars, so
Yeah.
um, those are the ones I'm interested in. I think Richie James makes the most sense. He's interesting because they don't have that kind of player right now.
They might get the most out of him. He might have the most to add to the team.
Yeah. Any other receivers you want to talk about, or should we wrap up here?
I think we need to wrap up. It was not a great receiving free agent class this year, even when before any of them started to sign at other teams, and
Yeah,
now it's even less so.
exactly. Well, anyway, thanks so much for coming in and listening. We talked a little bit about pro days, we talked a little bit about Rodgers and the Jets, and we talked a little bit about free agency. If you liked what you heard, once again, come follow us on Twitter at FatherSonPacker. Subscribe to us wherever you can find podcasts. Subscribe to us on YouTube. We'd really appreciate it. It would help our numbers. And then, until next time, go Pack Go.
Go Pack Go.